afternoon, sports fans, and welcome to today's lecture on the architecture of spectacle in the ancient Roman world. I'm your professor, Dr. Rob Steffen, and today we're going to shift our perspective from the action in the arena to the arenas themselves. That's right, we're going to take a look at the buildings and structures associated with Roman spectacle, with sort of a specific eye towards understanding how these edifices would have impacted the experience of the fans. I mean, the whole reason we call these spectacles instead of sport is that the emphasis is placed on the people viewing the events rather than the people participating in the events. And the physical buildings that house those spectators undoubtedly influence their experience at the games. So don't forget where your seat is, or you might miss out on all the action. Instead, journey with me as we investigate spectacular Roman architecture. So almost everybody, when they think of Roman sports architecture, thinks of the big two, right? The Colosseum, home of those bloody gladiatorial contests, and the Circus Maximus, site of the chaotic chariot races. And this is for good reason, right? These structures were absolutely awesome. But the final forms of these sports facilities were relatively late constructions. I mean, the Colosseum wasn't built until well into the Roman Empire. And the early days of sports in ancient Rome took place in a much more varied setting. So in those earliest days, Rome housed its spectacles in usually temporary structures. So when it comes to gladiatorial combats, these were often set up in the Forum Romanum, or the Roman Forum in ancient Rome. The Roman Forum was the hub of activity in the ancient city, right? Combining commercial activity, people selling things, with religious temples, with political buildings, like the Roman Senate House. And in approximately 800 years that Rome was around prior to the Colosseum being built in 80 CE, many of Rome's gladiatorial fights took place in open spaces within the Forum, where kind of a temporary fighting space would have been marked off with wooden barriers, and spectators might have sat on wooden bleachers. Now, after the games were over, those stands would have then been dismantled, and the next set of games would have been months or days later, and they would have been rebuilt during that time. Now, ancient Roman historians do tell us of some of the more complex structures for gladiatorial fights in the days before the Colosseum. So according to Pliny, in 52 BCE, a guy by the name of Curio built two adjacent theaters right next to each other to showcase funeral performances for his recently deceased father. It began with music and plays inside each individual theater. And then in the afternoon, these theaters somehow rotated, with the people still inside. This must have been quite the incredible experience, to form the very first amphitheater, right? Two half circles coming together to form a circle. And it was there that the funeral gladiatorial contests would have been held. Now, the first official permanent amphitheater in Rome wasn't built until 29 BCE, about 500 years after the Circus Maximus. Now that first one, it burned down just a few decades later in 64 in the famous kind of fire where Nero was fiddling while Rome burned. And that whole episode, the burning of Rome, that paved the way for the Colosseum a few years later. Now the foundation of the Circus Maximus, the main site for chariot racing in Rome, dates back more than 500 years prior to the Colosseum, and its foundation is traditionally attributed to Tarquin the Elder, the first Etruscan king of Rome in the 6th century BCE. Now that date isn't particularly certain, but what is certain is that for hundreds of years afterwards, the structure itself was pretty insubstantial. It would mainly have been a kind of large field for chariot racing, and spectators would have sat on grassy banks or maybe on flimsy wooden bleachers. And so it's not until the 2nd century BCE, more than 3 centuries after its foundation, that we start to get more permanent structures within the Circus Maximus. So the takeaway point here is that in its earliest days, right, sport and spectacle in Rome took place in some pretty ephemeral places, right, either in temporary wooden arenas or in large empty fields. But as Rome grew in size, and in power, and in wealth throughout the growth of the Roman Republic and Empire, these sports facilities grew along with it, becoming more spectacular than you could ever imagine. So as we just mentioned, the origin of the Circus Maximus, or the Great Track as it translates from the original Latin, goes back deep into Roman history. But for the first few centuries of its existence, it really wasn't much of a built structure, so much as an open place for chariot racing. The Circus Maximus was located in the depression between the Palatine and the Aventine Hills in Rome. And in later imperial times, this location allowed for a private bridge to be constructed from the emperor's private residence on the Palatine Hill to the emperor's private luxury box, known in Latin as the pulvinar, inside the circus itself. And just as with Greek hippodromes, right, the Roman circuses, and especially the Circus Maximus, these things were huge. So it was almost 600 meters on its long side and 80 meters wide, meaning that a full lap around the Circus Maximus would have been just short of a mile. Now, in the center of the circus was something known as the Euripus, or the spina, which divided the long sides of the track in order to prevent head-on collisions. And this was one of the main differences between Roman circuses and Greek hippodromes. Greek hippodromes only had a turning post and nothing to prevent those kind of terrifying head-on crashes. Now, the starting gates within the circus would have been slightly staggered to ensure that horses towards the center didn't get too much of an advantage. And those gates would have been operated using a spring mechanism, something that you'd pull, to ensure that all gates opened at the exact same time. And the finish line, that would have been in the middle of the opposite long side of the track, right in front of the judge's box. There would have been a lap counter in the middle, right? So you can count how many laps take place. And these originally took the form of eggs and then dolphins, and we're not really sure how those worked, but that's what the Roman historians say. You would have had to count off 7 of those, right? The first person to finish 7 laps would have been declared the victor. Now, all these structures didn't appear at once, right? They were built up over time. And often they were built up by some of Rome's most aspiring politicians. So the starting gates were first constructed in 329 BCE. And the permanent Euripus, or the spina, that thing in the center, that was likely a 2nd century BCE invention. And Julius Caesar himself, in the 1st century BCE, was the first person to change the lower tier of seating from wood to stone. That's right, it took almost 500 years to get stone seating in the Circus Maximus. Now, the emperors didn't stop there, right? So Augustus, Caesar's adopted heir and Rome's very first emperor, built heavily onto the Euripus, that central barrier. So he added things like statues of famous Roman people and of the gods, and he added trophies from his conquests abroad, and he even added an obelisk taken straight from Egypt. So how cool is that, right? You could see an actual Egyptian obelisk in the center of the Circus Maximus in Rome more than 2,000 years ago. And Augustus was also the first person to develop the pulvinar, right? That private imperial box seat to watch over the games from. 100 years after Augustus, it was the Roman Emperor Trajan who took things to the next level. So he constructed the monumental facade for the entire structure, right? Making it look somewhat like an elongated Colosseum with tiers of arches surrounding the exterior. And modern estimates for seating at the Circus Maximus at this time under Trajan, right after his remodel of the circus, they range from 150,000 on the low end to like 350,000 on the high end. That's like 7 different Arizona football stadiums all put together, and bigger than any stadium that we have in the world today. Now, because of this massive size, we don't have many fully excavated circuses. They're just too big. And the Circus Maximus in Rome looks more like an open field today than it does a sparkling beacon of ancient Roman architecture. But if we travel around the Roman Empire, we can see a few in better condition. So over here, we can see the circus at the site of Leptis Magna in North Africa, majestically situated by the sea, and with starting gates that are particularly well preserved. Now over here, we can see the remains of the circus at Antinopolis in Egypt, named for the best friend and perhaps lover of Alexander the Great. And what we can see here is an almost perfectly preserved circus lying just under the sand. So it's identifiable through aerial or drone photography. So how cool is that? And you can walk through modern Istanbul and see the location of the old circus in Constantinople, capital of the Roman Empire in late Roman antiquity. And in the modern urban fabric of the town, you can still see the outline of the circus, and the spina still exists there with some of the monuments that would have been there in antiquity. So overall, circuses housed the most popular spectacles in all of Rome. For more than 1,000 years, these were far more popular than the gladiatorial games. And the sheer size of these structures is absolutely mind-boggling, even to the modern observer and in light of our modern sports architecture. They must have been quite the place to watch the chaotic chariot races in Roman antiquity. Now, probably even more so than the Circus Maximus, the Colosseum is the most famous sports structure, and probably the most famous single individual structure of any type that we've got from the ancient Roman world. It still towers majestically in the heart of the hustle and bustle of the modern city of Rome, and it's not difficult to imagine, or at least reimagine, the bloody battles in the arena with tens of thousands of fans screaming in the stands. Now, like we talked about earlier, the earliest gladiatorial games were put on in temporary wooden structures in sites like the Forum. Now, our oldest permanent stone amphitheater that we have preserved from the Roman world, it actually comes from the site of Pompeii, right? Buried in the ash of Mount Vesuvius. And it dates to about 80 BC, a century and a half before the Colosseum in Rome. Now, it's important to understand here that the term amphitheater is the official term for the type of structure that the Colosseum actually is. And it literally means like both or two theaters or scene on both sides. And you can get the sense that it does kind of look like two ancient Roman theaters, right? Those semicircular structures having been smashed together on their flat sides to form a circular or an oval structure. And we can see at Pompeii that from its earliest iteration, these permanent amphitheaters were a little elongated and oval in nature, with stone walls and stone seating for the fans. Now, the most famous amphitheater in the world is, of course, the Colosseum in Rome. It was begun in 75 CE, right on top of the site of Nero's Golden House, a way to repay the common people for the destruction that Nero wrought during his reign as emperor. And it was finished a few years later by the Emperor Titus in 80 CE. Now, officially, this structure is and was known as the Flavian Amphitheater, named after the dynasty that built it. And it gets its nickname, the Colosseum, from a colossal bronze statue that stood out in front of it, a remnant of Nero's old golden house. Now, the Colosseum is absolutely massive in scale, so it rises 150 feet from the surrounding streets. And it consists of 4 massive stories, each built with a series of arches to reduce the weight and to provide entrances to the masses. Now, just like in modern football stadiums, these entrances, 76 of them in total around the outside, they were numbered. In Roman numerals, of course. And your ticket for the games would have told you which one to go into to find your seat. And once inside, you'd be sitting with approximately 50,000 of your closest friends to watch the beast hunts, the executions, and the Roman gladiatorial games. Now, the seating inside the Colosseum did more than just provide a good view. Here, the ranks of Roman society more broadly were recreated in the way that they sat inside the arena. So the senators sat down below, closest to the action at the bottommost rows. Then we get the other important officials right above them. And right above those officials, you get the ordinary citizens and soldiers. Then we get about a 15-foot kind of vertical wall that's separating those ranks, right? The senators, the officials, the citizens, from the people in the uppermost ranks of the Colosseum. And in those upper levels, we would first get non-citizens and foreigners and slaves. And then at the very, very top of the Colosseum, we get the women. So the physical structure of the Colosseum in many ways reinforced the social structure of Roman society. Senators in those kind of prized positions at the bottom, and then the slaves sitting at the kind of nosebleed section up at the top. Now, the rest of the arena was equally as complex. Oh, and also when we say the word arena, you've heard that a bunch of times, we're actually using another Latin term here. So the word arena comes from the word harena, meaning sand, because sand is what covered the floor of the Colosseum and all amphitheaters in the Roman world. So harena or arena means sand. That sand, however, sat on an artificial floor in the Colosseum, not on solid ground. And below that floor, we get a series of subterranean hallways and chambers in which the fighters and animals would have been housed prior to their matches. So we can see that over here. We also get a series of trap doors and pulleys and elevators, and these would have been used to bring up animals and gladiators, sometimes right in the middle of an exciting battle. And at the very top of the Colosseum, that had its own tricks as well. So in order to protect the spectators from the brutal midday sun of Italy, a massive awning was constructed to provide shade. And what's even cooler is that this awning, it was retractable, right? That's right. So the Colosseum had a retractable roof, just like the cutting-edge football stadiums in our world today. But the Colosseum was just the most famous of hundreds of amphitheaters throughout the Roman world, which contained well over 200 of these structures. And we can still see the impressive remains at many of those sites, like Udine in North Africa, or El Gem, also in North Africa. In France, we can see them at the sites of Arles, in Nîmes. In Italy, we've got amphitheaters at the sites of Pozzuoli, and at Pompeii, and at Verona, where you can still go watch different operas and performances inside the theater. We've got them at the site of Pula in Croatia, which looks almost exactly the same as the Colosseum in Rome. So you've got to go check these things out for yourself. These things are absolutely awesome. So we saw that in the ancient Greek world, the stadia were the place for most sporting events at Panhellenic Games at sites like Olympia. Now, even though the Romans gravitated towards spectacle, gladiatorial games and chariot racing, right? They also participated in your classic Greek-style sports, which especially became popular in the late Roman Republic and into the Roman Empire. Stadia, however, the main location for Greek sporting events, are far less common in the Roman world than in their Greek counterpart. So just like with the early gladiatorial games, many of the Greek-style sporting events would have just taken place in temporary structures or simply open spaces. So the Circus Maximus in Rome, for example, could have easily hosted all your classic running and throwing and combat sports in addition to chariot races. And we see that Julius Caesar and Augustus, they both built temporary structures for sporting events in the Campus Martius in Rome, that kind of open area in the bend in the river in the western part of the city of Rome. Now, the first permanent stone stadium in Rome was also built in the Campus Martius by the Emperor Domitian in 86 CE. So over here, the emperor started the Capitoline Games, honoring the Roman god Jupiter. And these games consisted of your classic Greek athletic events. And you can totally see what's going on here, right? He's modeling these games exactly on the Panhellenic Games that we talked about earlier in this course, right? So we've got Greek events dedicated to a god inside a stadium. This is classic Panhellenic game structure here, right? Except set in the Roman world. Moreover, the track within the Stadium of Domitian was 192 meters long, almost exactly the same length as the track at the Stadion at Olympia. Coincidence? I think not. Anyway, now there's not much left of it in terms of the actual structure of the Stadium of Domitian today. There are foundations underground, and if you know the kind of right people, you can go see some of those foundations. But if you get high up enough, in a balloon or a drone or an airplane, you can absolutely still see his stadium in Rome today. So the bustling open space known as Piazza Navona is built directly on the old stadium. And an aerial photo can still show you that it was flat on one end and curved on the other, with modern buildings still adopting that curvature on the north end of the stadium. Now today, Piazza Navona is one of the most happening places in the ancient city of Rome, with massive churches, with the Fountain of the Four Rivers by the Roman sculptor Bernini, and even with an Egyptian obelisk. Definitely check this out on your next trip to Rome. You won't be disappointed. You might get some weird looks if you do sprint down Piazza Navona like you were sprinting through the Stadium of Domitian. I highly recommend it anyway. Anyway, Roman stadia are far more common in the eastern part of Rome's empire. And we can see some Roman embellishments, like marble stone seating, at sites like Messini in Greece and even in Athens itself over here. The site of Perge in Turkey has one of the best preserved stadia dating to the Roman period. And other sites such as Ephesus, such as Aspendos, and such as Aphrodisias, they all actually kind of end up being really well-preserved stadia in the ancient Roman world. And this last one here, it's actually done something sort of unique, providing curved seating on both ends of the stadium. A development that's almost certainly focused on trying to get more people in there to see the games, since you don't lose the seats in the corners there. Now, as we saw at the beginning of this lecture, it doesn't take much to provide the bare minimum for spectacles, right? An open space, maybe some guardrails, maybe some wooden bleachers, that sort of thing. But with the Colosseum and the Circus Maximus and the Stadium of Domitian, we get incredibly elaborate structures. So why is that? Well, it's all for the spectators, of course, right? I know you've heard it a million times already, but we call these spectacles because the emphasis here is on the experience of the fans, of the spectators. So what was that experience like? Well, just like in today's world, you would have had to have a ticket to get in. But unlike the Super Bowl, these tickets were free. They'd be doled out in any variety of ways to citizens, right? Although you have to imagine that there would have also been a black market for these, right? Scalping tickets, just like there is at football games today. And once you had your ticket at the Colosseum, you had to enter through your appointed gate that was on your ticket to go find your appointed seat in whichever tier it was. And once inside, we've already seen how those seats were staggered based on social class, with senators at the bottom and in the best seats, with male citizens in the middle, and with slaves and women at the very top. Nevertheless, at amphitheaters outside of Rome, and at places like the Circus Maximus, there's significantly more mixing of the sexes. And in fact, the games were one of the places that Roman authors mention as being one of the hot spots for hooking up with people of the opposite sex. And in fact, our word fornication comes from the Latin word fornix, which means arch, which is in a reference to the arches at the Colosseum and the arches at the Circus Maximus, a good place to find somebody to have a little bit of fun with. So basically, the action wasn't just on the floor of the arena, it was in the stands as well. Now, we've also seen in previous lectures that the games were a great way for the Roman emperor to interact with his people. He was able to show them the benefits of empire, which they could chant, where they could chant messages to him about the current state of affairs. Both of those things could happen. Often the emperor would come up with clever ways to show his generosity. So at the gladiatorial games, tokens would often be dropped from above the stadium. And if you were lucky enough to get one, you could redeem it for food. And based on which token you got a piece of some sort of exotic meat from one of the exotic animals that was slain in the beast hunts in the morning. We also have something known in Latin as the sparsiones missilium, very literally, the sprinkled missiles. And what we might call these are something like door prizes in the form of these light wooden balls that would have been thrown into the audience, right? Imagine a t-shirt cannon blasting these things into the audience. And if you got one of those, you could redeem it for a prize as well, right? Something like food or cash, or we even have an example of someone winning an apartment for a year. Now, sometimes these games could turn dangerous, however. And we have numerous examples of riots erupting, either because of the action on the field or interactions with the emperor or just fights between regular people. Just like today, those fights were not necessarily uncommon. And this painting over here of the amphitheater at Pompeii shows a riot in the aftermath of one set of games. And the Nicaea riots in Constantinople in the 6th century CE, well, tens of thousands of people died in the aftermath of that riot, which erupted after the fans attempted to confront the Emperor Justinian. So all in all, heading to the games must have been an absolutely wild experience, and I can see why the Romans liked their bread and circuses so much. Okay, so today's past meets present seems pretty straightforward, right? When we look at the sports structures of the modern world, it's not hard to see parallels with ancient Rome. Our football stadiums look awfully similar to the Colosseum. And in fact, USC's football stadium actually is indeed called the Colosseum. Capacities are even similar. We saw that the Colosseum could hold about 50,000 people, and sure enough, today's football stadium's right in there with a similar size. So we've got Arizona Stadium holding about 56,000, which would fit right in line with amphitheaters in the ancient Roman world. Now, we don't really have the same set of subterranean trap doors from which gladiators and lions emerge in our modern stadiums, but we absolutely do have subterranean hallways and rooms for other purposes, right? So at Arizona Stadium, we've actually got dorms inside the stadium itself. And next door over at the McHale Center, where we play basketball, we've got hallways and offices and locker rooms and meeting rooms all located, that's right, underneath the basketball arena. Different purposes than the trapdoors in the Colosseum? Certainly. Similar idea? You betcha. Now, the largest football stadiums in the US today hold about twice the number of people as the Colosseum, with Michigan Stadium over here leading the way with a capacity of 107,601. And while that is indeed bigger than the Colosseum, it is even dwarfed by the capacity of the Circus Maximus. To get into that range, we need to take a look at kind of the world of car racing or motor racing tracks around the world today. So the biggest motor racing venue is the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, which can fit 257,325 spectators. And amazingly, that does exceed the low estimate for the Circus Maximus, right? 150,000 people. But it is still way smaller than the high estimate of 350,000 people. That's right, there could have been more people in the Circus Maximus, potentially, than the largest sporting venue that we have in the world today. So the experience for fans seems similar as well. So you'd get tickets, you'd enter through your appointed gate, you get food and drinks from the vendors, you cheer on your team, you hope to catch prizes that are thrown or shot into the crowd, and you hope to meet a fine-looking lady or gentleman to maybe spend a little extra time with. So maybe after all, going to the games isn't that similar, or isn't that different between antiquity and modernity. All right, you have made it to the end of another episode. And in today's lecture, we've taken a look at the athletic infrastructure of the ancient Roman world. We saw that in its earliest days, all this was quite ephemeral and temporary, with spectacles taking place in open fields or within temporary wooden structures. But over time, sites like the Circus Maximus grew, eventually holding more than 150,000 spectators and being built up with monumental marble facades. And the Colosseum, although somewhat late developing in Rome, was equally as impressive, with 4 stories of stone arches holding something like 50,000 fans and containing an incredibly intricate set of subterranean chambers to make the games come to life. Now, while Greek sports weren't as big of a deal in ancient Rome, they certainly still existed, as can be seen with the Stadium of Domitian, which you can still visit in Rome today when you go to Piazza Navona. And all this was to put on an awesome show for the spectators, for the fans, who are at the center of these massive productions. So next time you're at your favorite sporting event, make sure to say thanks to the Romans for their awesome idea of impressive athletic architecture. Maybe even send up a few Hail Caesars if you're into it. Just a couple lessons you can learn from spectacular Roman architecture.